sitting right over here. So thank you. Okay. And let's see. Okay. And Women and Gender Advocacy, that would be me. I'm Jennifer Deeshan, Coordinator of Women and Gender Advocacy in the Counseling and Advocacy Office. So, and then just a couple of things before we get started. Please, with the exception of Michelle, because we know you need to clarify for your class, if we can hold our questions or put them in the chat. If you think you might forget, put your question in the chat, and then we will have questions at the end. And then we will also have, I have an assessment, a very short assessment. It's only 5 questions. The computer tells me it only takes 2 minutes. I will put the link to that in the chat for those of you online. You can just click, submit, and you'll be done. So we appreciate it if you'll do that at the end. And then also for those of you here in the room, I have paper. Okay. All right. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Crisosto Apache is originally from Mescalero, New Mexico, on the Mescalero Apache Reservation. They are Mescalero Apache, Chiricahua Apache, and Diné Navajo. Of the Salt Clan, born for the Towering House Clan. They are an assistant professor of English and hold an MFA of Master of Fine Arts from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they are the author of 2 recently published books of poetry entitled Genesis and Ghostword. And if you see the line John Lee Genesis, that's correct. That's the way it's supposed to be. And Ghostword is not capitalized. So everything's correct in the description if you read that. And thank you so much for being with us. Crisosto, please welcome Crisosto Apache.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction. I'd like to thank the Kansas Community College for the invitation, as well as the OQS Diversity Club, Women and Gender Advocacy, and the Counseling and Advocacy Center. I think it was very nice that you invited me to speak today. So the presentation I'm going to give, I call it the Sovereign Gender and Sexuality, Embracing the Two-Spirit Tradition. We'll talk about a lot of the terminology and the historical aspect of the Two-Spirit concept. Let's see. I think I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully people can see this.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
All right.
So I'm originally from Mescalero, New Mexico, and growing up on the reservation. I was born and raised there. For me, it was kind of an interesting experience to go from a reservation and then move on to off the reservation. So most of my experience in my life has been living off the reservation, where I pursued an education, and then I worked in various different employment and developed myself as a nonprofit organizer for a good while. And now I continue to pursue my education to become a professor, which is really what I love. I love teaching English and creative writing, which is really what I do now. Okay, let's see. I think I'm not seeing my screen.
It's showing very clearly here.
Okay, I'll just kind of play by ear then. So I want to talk about this idea of what we look at when we're talking about the Two-Spirit identity. I think in recent years, a lot of the communities have been looking at this idea of empower and honor. So some of the criteria that many organizations and institutions have been trying to develop ideas around are the concepts of identity, the ideas of self, the concepts of respect, knowledge, culture, tradition, and community. These are really the primary ideas of what many aspects of the Two-Spirit Indigenous communities wanted to focus on and begin conversations on how many of these communities can begin to build an an infrastructure around these concepts so that they can start healing their communities. Because for a long time, the communities have been broken because of Western culture's encroachment on many of the traditions and culture surrounding indigenous communities. So a few of the traits that we look at as far as what indigenous communities identify with, one being culture, another being tradition, and the other being family. So as far as the culture, which identifies somebody within a society, or the name or essential characters that identifies a person within that culture. And for the tradition is defined as a set of characteristics that are recognized as belonging uniquely to a community and constituting their participation in life with that community. And then family connects ideas of sameness or belonging to the fact or condition of being part of the same or alike. So these ideas of family, tradition, and culture are really huge aspects of what defines a person as part of an indigenous culture. One of the main common ideas to think about when we're talking about indigenous identity is really stemming back in history. When we look at these ideas of what many indigenous communities look at as far as what they define as being part of these communities, is that when we look back in our past, we have many stories that define our emergence as people, as culture, as traditions. And many of the belief systems are based upon those stories and and rituals and traditions. And that's really where a lot of these two-spirit concepts have come out of. So this very moment of the beginning of time is one concept that many indigenous people and cultures and communities believe. So this is stemming across a lot of all the indigenous cultures in North America. So when I talk about this idea of mythology, I don't like to really use that term because it doesn't really define indigenous people as mythic people, because we're still alive, we're still thriving, we still practice our traditions, our beliefs, our culture, our languages, because we still embrace this concept of our indigeneity. So when we look at ourselves as indigenous people, we really have to kind of go back and look at some of these concepts so that we can continue to practice and also pass on this information to future generations. Because in our current day, there's many of these cultures, facets to these cultures are being lost because of the introduction of Western culture and Western civilization. It's becoming more difficult for many tribes and many tribal communities to hold on to things like language, to culture, to ceremony, to beliefs. All of these ideas that make them human in their own respect are really being lost and challenged concurrently. One thing we know about the Two-Spirit tradition is that there are prominent examples and historical figures that we have looked back to solidify our identity and to confirm our identity as Two-Spirit people. There are people like Wiwa, who is part of the Zuni nation. There was Ostish, who was part of the Blackfeet, and then there was Lozin and Tadatse, who was part of my tribe, the Cherakawa. And then there's Pine Leaf, who was much earlier in history. And then we have Hastinkla, who was part of the Dene nation. These figures are prominent figures in history that we have reverted back to as examples, because they also, in their own respective communities, have made a huge impact as part of that representation of what it means to be included in a community as who they were meant to be, without ridicule or without judgment. They all had a position in their culture that also contributed to the direction of the culture that they stem from. So a lot of times I'll look back at some of these historical figures and feel glad that I'm able to continue that tradition of advocating for this idea of the Two-Spirit identity. And it is these historical moments that get us to talk about what it means to be part of this ideology, part of this practice, part of this tradition, part of this passing on of information. There are tribal names for each of these tribal communities. They have embraced this concept of having two-spirit people live amongst people, their communities. So each one of them had contributions to add to the community where they are representing a part where many of the other parts of the community couldn't represent. So some of those names I have on the screen here. The ones that I'm more familiar with are the Dene terminology and Dinde terminology, because I am part Navajo and I am part Apache. And I'll show you a little bit more in the presentation about how these ideas are sort of broken up as far as gender expression. But for the Navajo, there's the Nadte, and then for the male representation of characteristics. And then there's also the Dishba, which is the female characteristics within the culture. And for the Inde, the Apache, there's Ndesan, which is the male aspect of that. There's the Yanaskani, which is the female. When we look at the Zuni, that was really what Wiwa was embodying, is this Lamana, the male. And then the Bote was Crow for Ashtish. In one of the books that I looked at, the Two-Spirit People, which is an academic book that was put together, that has a lot more of the terminology for each of these tribes that was more extended. I know there's been a lot of research done about trying to create a much larger list of tribal identities and names for which many of these tribes wanted to list, so that they are more accurate as far as the depictions and names of this list in terms of terminology for each of these gender expressions. Earlier on, there have been derogatory terms, and this was like at the turn of the century, the late 1800s. There was the term Berdache that came out of the historical context, and it's come to find out that this term is no longer used or embraced by indigenous communities. You will still see a lot of this term used in academic correspondences, but it's come to the understanding of a lot of indigenous people that this term is derogatory. So we no longer use this term Berdache, which a lot of westernized academics and anthropologists use to describe two-spirit people. The root meaning or the etymology of the word comes from the Persian, which is the idea of a kept person, which is a young person that is usually a kept enslaved person that was considered the equivalent of a prostitute. So the term Berdache is no longer used or embraced by indigenous communities. Other terminology or concepts that have come out of the 20th century is the gay Native American or the gay natives, which really describes Native American GLBT people living in westernized urban communities. And many of this identity has come out of the gay Indian movement, gay Indian American movement out in San Francisco in the 1970s, which was really the first organization that was founded by indigenous people who were living in San Francisco, who really wanted to go back and look at the identity of indigenous people and really embrace the concept of being gay in America, which at the time was sort of being lost because many traditions have been overcome by Western influence. The modern term two-spirit has been coined by North American indigenous descendants because they felt like this idea of two spirits was the closest thing that they could define themselves in English, aside from the traditional terminology that many tribes identified with. So this is the term that many indigenous people have embraced. Another term that has come out of the 21st century is the indigiqueer, which is another term that is used alongside Two-Spirit, but often is one that where many indigenous people don't really identify with the term Two-Spirit because of the tribal and cultural associations the term has. So indigiqueer is one term that many people identify because it doesn't have a direct tie to the ceremonial or the social role or the traditional aspects of Two-Spirit designation. So the term Two-Spirit has come out of the annual International Two-Spirit Gathering that happened in 1989. It was the third international Two-Spirit Gathering that was organized by Two-Spirit people in Minnesota. And the original word stems from the Ojibwa or the Anishinaabe language, Nijminidoig, which really is the literal Two-Spirit in English. But again, this term has really evolved into a lot of various different ways that indigenous people identify with the terminology. With each community, the social construct for the words and phrases identifying Two-Spirit traditional and cultural identity is not really influenced by Western acculturation or colonization. This embracement of the word is one that is continued used to this day. But the transformation of identity has really moved outside the scope of Two-Spirit because of how indigenous people are moving in the Western environment of culture today. So the term Two-Spirit is loosely used by those who do identify with the cultural aspect. But when we look into the urban settings, the indigiqueer is really what most people are using. And sometimes they're also used synonymously, depending on how the identity is merging with each concept. But the term Two-Spirit, one of the ideas that have come out of this translation from English to many indigenous cultures is the literal translation of what it means. So a lot of indigenous people don't really use the term Two-Spirit because of how it translates into language. Just in the case of the Apache and also the Navajo, the term Two-Spirit is really like this concept of one who is mentally unwell. So there's that aspect to the term Two-Spirit. Now, as far as like the binary for how the concept works with indigenous communities, here we see an example of the Western American binary, which is very linear, and how it's broken up into the idea of the biological, and also the expression, and then also the appearance, and then also the identity. So looking at these various different scopes of how the Western American binary works is very linear. So you'll have to look at how your identity, whether it's put in any of these categories, is expressed or how it's identified. So we look at this as very linear, which is not the case when we look at the ways that a lot of indigenous communities identify. Where there's a very circular or cyclic kind of interaction. The representation here with how many indigenous communities identify comes with this what they call the medicine circle. In this medicine circle, there's 4 different colors that are represented as part of the community that defines the culture. One being white, which talks about the idea of behavior. The red, which is representative of respect, black, which represents knowledge, and yellow relationships. But this idea of the medicine wheel is one that is very interactive. It does not look very at the perspective in a very linear way. This representation of the medicine wheel represents the idea of balance. It defines the season. It also defines the life cycles. We look to this medicine wheel for the cardinal directions. It also defines emergent phases, cosmological cycles, sacred colors, gender structures, and social structures. So when we look at this idea of the circle, it's really encompassing many of the ideas of how Indigenous communities identify on a personal level and also on a communal level. So it's kind of like a 3D sphere as opposed to just a flat circle with these colors intertwining. So when we look at the cultural model of how the gender structure is represented, because I come from a matrilineal society, I usually list the feminine first, or the female, which is the first gender, and that's where the characteristics are normally expressed with the feminine and also the biological female. And then we move into the second gender, which is a combination of female and male, the characteristics of the expression and also the biological designation. And then we move into the third gender, which is male, the characteristics of the biology and also the female, the male characteristics of expression. And then we move into the fourth gender, which is male-female, quite the opposite of the second gender. So this idea of how gender expression and sexuality is separate and try to represent a multitude of expressions and identity is something that the Indigenous communities have embraced for their existence, where they are allowed to participate in the community as how they were born, given as gifts by the Creator. So in a lot of ways, a lot of people are still trying to figure out more on the Western side how this gender structure works, and how is it that this gender structure can be an influential model for integrating itself into some of the confines of Western culture. Because I think we're sort of at this moment where we're looking for a model that can best represent everybody. I've seen a lot of evolution in the way that people are beginning to see this idea of gender expression, gender structure, this idea of identity. And I think being able to have this conversation on how this expression works is kind of a unique perspective. A lot of the students that I work with in my classrooms haven't really been introduced to this kind of model, even though it's very unique and very familiar with Indigenous communities. A lot of my students are like really excited to see something that has been practiced over time, and a model that is much older than the gender system that Western culture has presented, that has a lot of characteristics of shame, of these bad feelings that are guilt that are associated with the binary system of Western culture. So when we look at identity from an Indigenous perspective, it's a very complex sense of identity, because we have to look at a lot of ideas that are surrounding who we are as Indigenous people. There's a lot of things that we have to consider when it comes to looking at our identity. And it's not just really from one concept, it's from a lot of different concepts because of what has been introduced from Western culture, from the time that the Europeans had come over and taken over North America. A lot of Indigenous tribes tried to figure out how they were going to work with this new encroachment. So when we look at the idea of sovereignty and identity, we look at the idea of tribal and cultural identity, the historical identity, the reclamation identity, the gender identity, the sexual identity, and also the political identity. When we break these ideas into sections, we have to then begin to look at and examine these ideas of how many of these components are facets of every Indigenous person's identity in the United States and North America. When we look at tribal and cultural identity, we have to examine the idea of relationship to individuals, tribes, and culture. And going back to this concept of time immemorial. The concept of time immemorial is an idea that stems from the beginning of time, which means that every Indigenous person and culture has an acknowledgement of an existence that has stemmed from a very beginning. And that's where they emerged from, is this very beginning. And each tribal and community, their definition for this beginning of time, it's a very different story for each one of them. So going back and talking about some of these emergent stories, which have direct contributions to cultural identity, ceremonial activities, and traditions, are a huge facet of this concept of time immemorial. But I think that's one thing that Western ideology doesn't understand, is that when they look back at a lot of the Indigenous cultures, this concept of time immemorial has been there. It has been a part of each individual's identity because they participate in these tribal communities and activities and belief systems. Which is why I think it's such a complex issue when it comes to talking about this idea of identity and all the various different facets that surround it. Another concept is looking at the historical identity, which is the acknowledgement of our past. It's one thing that we cannot forget, and it's one thing that a lot of Westernized cultures don't really have conversation around. This past spring and summer, I taught a course on Indigenous poetics, where I used the history of the United States and the relationship of Indigenous people and what occurred historically, and then paired that with many writers and poets who expressed this idea or perspective in their writing, which I thought was a very unique way of looking at history, where we can talk about a lot of the historical acknowledgements of what has happened in the past. And when I talk about the historical identity, what I'm talking about is really how many Indigenous people were displaced. They were moved forcefully from their traditional homelands, placed in a very different place, and a lot of everything that they knew as part of their culture was disrupted. So that having this historical disruption impacts the identity for how they connect to their environment, the land, their ancestry, and where their ancestors used to live, the societies and communities that they developed in their original homelands. It was no longer there, so they were removed from those original places. And a lot of people in conversation that I've had in the past, I talk about this idea of diaspora, Indigenous diaspora, and a lot of people don't believe that that concept associates to Indigenous people because we're still here in the United States. But what most people don't understand is that tribal identity is connected to the land and to the places where their ancestors lived. And it was, and many of these cultures were uprooted from that very forcefully and moved to other places. So in that situation, because of the connection to these historical places and ancestral places, this idea of diaspora does exist. Just because the United States deems the United States as their country, it was not always that way, because Indigenous people had existed here long before the arrival of Europeans. So this connection to the land, it stems much longer than 1492. The idea, and then moving on to the idea of reclamation and the identity, which is the responsibility of maintaining culture and tradition. Because of that disruption, it has sort of extracted this idea of culture and tradition from Indigenous people. So these ideas that regarded gender expression, social community, tradition, culture, ceremony, all of these concepts were slowly being eradicated. So when you start to look at a lot of tribal communities now, you're going to find that a lot of these communities are struggling to hold on to their concepts of culture and tradition, their languages, their ceremonies. Many of these concepts are slowly being taken away or are not being remembered. But there's a huge push for many of these communities to try to hang on to what they have. And so a lot of them are implementing a lot of programs to try to hold on to languages and to their ceremonies and to their traditions and culture. So they're trying to make it so that many of the young people can learn these various facets of culture and begin to embrace that and then pass it on to their future generations. Many of the concepts of this idea of reclamation stem back from a lot of the elders, and as we can see, as time moves on, elders are slowly, dying, and many of those traditions of knowledge and culture pass away with them. So I think there's a desperate moment now that many tribal communities are learning this. So they're trying to talk to as many elders and try to grasp a lot of this knowledge to hold on to. So it's very essential to look at this idea of reclamation, the responsibility of maintaining culture and tradition, because that's how we define ourselves as Indigenous people. Gender identity, the expression of self to family and community. There's huge evidence throughout history that many of the Indigenous cultures had very complex social systems. And these systems defined how individuals move in the community. They were responsible for a lot of the facets of how the community operated from day to day. What is really unique about this system is that there was a place for Two-Spirit people. And the responsibilities for Two-Spirit people were hugely defined, and the contributions they gave to communities was essential. A lot of the Two-Spirit people in many of these communities were holy people. They were medicine men. A lot of them took care of orphans. A lot of the Two-Spirit people married couples. They also were responsible for separating couples. So there's a lot of various different responsibilities that Two-Spirit people had in the culture. There was a huge influence. There was a concept in the idea of identifying Two-Spirit people, that if people were identified as Two-Spirit people, that it was seen as a gift. That if there was that continued support of allowing Two-Spirit people to participate fully in communities, that means that their communities would flourish. So there was a huge embrace of this idea or concept of having Two-Spirit people in communities. The idea of sexual identity, I think, is one of those concepts, is an identity of again, the self and the community. But I think there's a lot of people who, when they look at sexuality, it's kind of an idea that many people are really uncomfortable with, because it has a lot of the expressions of human need, right? And people aren't really sure how to deal with that because of the feelings that are associated with that: embarrassment, uncomfortable, guilt, all these feelings that come along with sexual expression. But Native American people or Indigenous people didn't really see it that way. They saw it as a human idea, and it's a human need that everybody has, and it's a very natural one. So to feel, sort of this concept of being uptight about it is something that that Indigenous people didn't really embrace, because it brought about these ideas of shame, uncomfortability, non-participatory, guilt, which are feelings that many Indigenous people didn't believe in, because again, they wanted everybody to participate in a very healthy way in the communities, because otherwise, if they didn't, the communities would suffer from that. So this communal idea of accepting many of these concepts around sexual identity was seen as a human need, and there wasn't any negative ideas that came out of that. Then finally, there's the political identity that has come at the early part of the 20th century and the 21st century, because that was the introduction of policy and legislation. It was these policies and legislations that gave a new rise and identity for Indigenous people, because if we look at the ways that laws and policy regulate Indigenous people, it's very important to understand that. When we look at laws and policy regarding states, it's up to the states to enact those particular laws and legislations from a state standpoint. But when you look at Indigenous people, because of how they are seen in a much larger scale, it was the United States government that was responsible for their stewardship, which means that the United States government took it upon their responsibility to take care of Indigenous people. So therefore, on a federal level, Indigenous people have an association with the government in that way. They don't belong to the states. They don't belong to the counties. They belong really to the United States government, which is an issue on a political level and a historical level, because Indigenous people really wanted to govern themselves. They wanted this idea of sustaining their own communities, but that unfortunately didn't happen. And it was through these policies and legislations that designed this idea of stewardship or even guardianship of Native American people. So when laws are passed and when policies are passed on a national level, that directly impacts Indigenous communities across the board. States can decide, when something like that is passed, whether they want to challenge that or not. But it really impacts this idea of Indigenous people firsthand because of that national designation, that federal designation. So when you look at the ideas of policy from a historical point of view, we're going to see that there was very specific policies and legislation designed to govern Indigenous people and not necessarily the citizens of the United States, which were two different separate ideas. So it gets pretty complicated. And that's one thing that I think my students, when I taught this course, was they didn't realize that there was a separate legal aspect for Indigenous people specifically. And that had nothing to do with the citizens of the United States, which are two separate ideas. And how this impacts Indigenous communities, we're going to find out if here is the way that these policies worked. But before we talk about that, three concepts about that impact this idea of two-spirit identity, which is the concept of colonization, acculturation, and assimilation. These three concepts are what has really fragmented the concepts of Indigenous culture and identity, traditions and ceremony. Because really the terms of colonization, acculturation, and assimilation are ideas that have stemmed from the very beginning. It was the United States government and military to forcefully take the United States through manifest destiny so that they can have this country for themselves. And it was unfortunate to them to see that Native Americans or Indigenous people had already occupied the land prior to that. So then we became the issue, we became the problem. And how is it that they were going to deal with this situation? So looking historically at this idea of identity really stems through this idea of colonization, acculturation, and assimilation, which brings Indigenous people to the modern age and how Indigenous people identify to this day. So there's a lot of complex issues that come out of this idea of colonization, which is the assimilation, acculturation, and eradication, or even the erasure of culture, tradition, and values, and identity from the dominant culture. And that impacts the idea of acculturation, which is the process in which the individual adopts or acquires and adjusts to a new cultural environment as the result of being placed into a new culture. So this was happening throughout the whole existence of the United States coming here and deciding that this country was going to be theirs. And then finally, the idea of assimilation, the process of becoming a part or making someone become a part of a group, community, or society. So getting rid of culture, tradition, ceremony, language, identity is still one of the goals of Western civilization. They still want to eradicate the Indian. They still want to kill the Indian and save the man, which was a concept by Colonel Richard Pratt, who established the boarding schools in the turn of the century. One of the things that have come out of this is the idea of the historical encroachment is this idea of historical trauma. It's one of the things that many Indigenous communities are looking at to see how the impact of Manifest Destiny has on Indigenous community, because of how many Native Americans were being removed from their ancestral lands and being forced on these lands from that they didn't originate from. This idea of historical trauma has come out of this concept. Many of the ideas or characteristics that we look at and define it even more specifically is the idea of the intergenerational transmission of trauma, which is passed down from one generation to the next. This is a common idea that I really did associate with throughout my whole life. Earlier on in my own personal experience, I didn't understand the characteristics of what was happening to me. But it wasn't until I started reading a lot of books on this idea of the history of the United States and what that meant and how that impacted my sense of identity. And it was through this historical trauma that has been transformed and also transposed onto my own sense of identity. I then started looking at my mother's identity and my grandmother's identity and how they talked about that historically. And I started to realize that these are many of the characteristics that has been passed on from generation to generation. Once I started to understand this idea, then I started talking to my mother about it. And she then started to understand that how can we start changing some of these concepts or some of these characteristics that were so damaging to these communities that contributed to the idea of chemical dependency and domestic violence and all these unnatural, unhealthy ways of display. So when we look at this idea of intergenerational trauma, we look at the idea of hate crime, verbal aggression, ignorance, neglect, domestic violence, chemical dependency, unsafe sexual practices, sexual assault and aggression, a lot of unreported crimes, discrimination, racism, classism, sexism, genderism. And when you look at this list, it goes on and on and on. It doesn't stop. These are the kind of disparities that have come out of this idea of historical trauma. And many tribal communities are trying to figure out how they can restore this balance back to the concept of the indigeneity of people. So looking at many of these problems that have come out of history, changing some of these notions. And there was a movement that came out of this that supported the idea of healing, the idea of aiming to empower Indigenous communities in the aid of obtaining accurate historical context. And also the dispersal of information from Native American Indigenous Two-Spirit identities. So looking back at this historical trauma concept, when you pair that with Two-Spirit identity, we begin to identify a lot of the more specific characteristics of that disparity that impact Two-Spirit people in many of these communities. So looking at the national policies and this idea of sovereignty, we're looking at many of these policies that are kind of old now. Back in 1996, there was DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. This directly impacted tribes because it was a national policy. So there was the Coquille tribe and the Oglala Nation, the Little Transverse Bay bands of Ottawa, and the Suquamish tribes who look back at their own constitutions to see how they can change or not even acknowledge the fact that the idea of the Defense of Marriage Acts can be utilized or implemented in their tribal constitution. Which now we know that we have a national policy that everyone can recognize as far as marriage equality. We also have to look at the VEWA Act, which is the Violence Against Women Act that was enacted in 1994. And this is focuses more on the idea of accountability, the idea of holding perpetrators accountable to the full extent of the law, also creating awareness around violence against women and Two-Spirit people on tribal communities. The act of VEWA, one of their focuses was also to train tribal law enforcement to also identify best practices in working with two-spirit families and tribal communities, especially with women. And we're going to find out why this is important here in a couple of seconds. The Office of the National AIDS Policy, which was enacted in '93, which is ONAP, is directed at the representation of those living and directly impacted with HIV, and how training can best be implemented in tribal communities, and how they can work best with two-spirit people. Other concepts that many tribal communities looked at is how to address hate crime laws and protection, which encourages tribes to adopt and enforce hate crime laws to include two-spirit people. Many tribes now are really trying to figure out how to work best with two-spirit people. And even the concept of giving highlights to women and the issues that come along with the concepts of hate crime. And there's a concept, there was an organization in the Dene Nation, which was called at the time, the Dene Rainbow Coalition, was one of the forced organizations that was formed out of this concept of addressing hate crime. And they promoted a lot of ideas of policies and legislations to change the climate of hate crimes on the reservation. Also looking at bullying laws and safety, working with tribal schools and school youth programs to develop safe zones for youth. Many of these developments have moved forward and have made progressive institutions out of these concepts so that they can begin to remain supports as programs develop on tribal lands. But here in the recent year, we have faced a lot of challenges. I think the biggest one is the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which was overturned Friday, June 24th of 2022. How this directly impacts tribal communities is that now we have to look at how missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives are being impacted. How now because of this overturning, many of these emphases will go away. Two-spirit and other members of the LGBTQIA community will be impacted by the overturning of Roe versus Wade. People living with disability, people who lack income and wealth. So many of these concepts do impact two-spirit people on tribal communities because this is a national policy. One that happened in recent months is the challenge of ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that was enacted in 1978 to protect children who are living on reservations. It was recently that Holland and Bracken had presented a lawsuit that started out in Texas, but previously was addressed in Louisiana and Indiana, is where several of the plaintiffs had alleged that ICWA was unconstitutional. And these are people that are non-Indigenous. So right now, this is currently in legislation. The Supreme Court listened to or presided over this case on November 9th, 2022. So this is something that I think is going to be interesting to kind of watch over the upcoming year, because these are the two policies that do impact Indigenous communities on a much broader level. So when we go back and look at this idea of empower and honor, this idea of cycle is something that I'm always looking at because it does pertain to a huge part of myself. I look at this idea of identity, which looks at the individual and the communal aspects of participation, and also the respect, which is looking at ourselves and how we relate to others and how others relate to us. And also looking at the idea of knowledge and education. How are we going to continue to pass on the knowledge and education of who we are from an Indigenous perspective, culturally, traditionally, and ceremonially, even lingually, how we're going to maintain our languages, which moves on to the culture and traditional aspect, passing this information on, therefore defining the community and family. So as we can see how these specific components interact, it moves toward this concept of mending the sacred circle, because there was a moment where the circle was broken. So I think the empowerment or even the ideas that come out of this recognition that we have a very strong sense of culture, tradition, language, and ceremony, which defines us as Indigenous communities, and how Two-Spirit people are able to participate as they are intended, is part of this circle. So if we can begin to empower and recognize the tradition of Two-Spirit people and keep that concept going, we can continue to look at our broader community and see how we can begin to make some of these adjustments so that we are making a place for future generations. Some of the things that I'm seeing now in society, as far as some of these supports, is that there's a concept of the Two-Spirit powwow that has evolved. I'm seeing more activities like this that are prevalent to support a lot of the urban places that where Two-Spirit people reside. I think the popular one that most people are aware of is the Bates powwow, the Bay American Indian Two-Spirit organization out in San Francisco. They have been putting on this Two-Spirit powwow for a number of years, and it's become very, very popular. I haven't had the opportunity to go there because my working schedule hasn't permitted me to go, but I'm still trying to make time so that I can go and participate in this powwow. I also noticed that there are other places outside of San Francisco and Bates that are putting on powwows at local events. So to see this kind of empowerment happening where community building is taking place so that there is a place for Two-Spirit people to participate culturally, traditionally, and being part of what makes them Indigenous, I think is a really great thing that has emerged. Also, there are prominent figures in the Two-Spirit community that are advocating through their own ways of identifying. One of them that recently happened here in Denver is a program by drag queens, Two-Spirit drag queens, that put on a show at local bars called Wagon Burners, which is the name of their show. I wasn't able to attend, but a couple of my friends that were part of this event, which helped raise awareness surrounding Indigenous Two-Spirit identity, which I think is a very great thing to happen, engaging in the community in this way. Another thing that I'm seeing a lot more of is Two-Spirit LGBTQ and allies advocating for this idea of recovery and support systems and support groups. With the recent pandemic idea, there's a lot of Zoom meetings that are happening now, which makes it more accessible for many people to participate in many parts of the country. So this idea of Zooming, I think, is kind of an interesting way of engagement for Two-Spirit communities and support. There's a toolkit that has come out of Portland, Oregon, that was edited by Siadam Edmo and Aaron Writings. They sought to one point to put together this toolkit, this tribal toolkit, so that they can begin developing programs for Two-Spirit people. So this is still a program that is in evolution. They continue to update and revise this toolkit so that it provides the most current information. Within this toolkit, there's a small phrase that is acknowledged, and one hope that they hope they can continue to do, which they title Future. In the spirit of this stewardship, we respectfully acknowledge our generations rising, for it is in their interests that we carry forward this work, and it is to them that we entrust it. So this idea of empowering community and providing tools for many tribal communities to have is one of the things that I'm seeing. And I've been looking at more of the current toolkits which is the version here, that have come out of Portland, Oregon with the two editors. This film, Two Spirits, is one that I continue to advocate for. I still show it and still get invitations to show this film. It was one of the first films that addressed the idea of the two-spirit identity, which utilized the murder of Fred J. Martinez, who was murdered by Sean Murphy on June 17th, 2001, here in the state of Colorado, in a small town named Cortez. Fred was a 16-year-old who also identified as Nadle from the Dene culture, but also saw himself as a much broader identity in how he recognized himself. The story is really told through his mother, Pauline Mitchell, and she really describes this, heart-wrenching situation that have come out of it. But one thing that I do appreciate about this film is how this situation stemmed out of the historical significance of the Western perspective and how that perspective had impacted the Dene culture and also the two-spirit culture across the board. The film is 54 minutes and it was directed by Lydia Nibley. The film had its debut back in 2010 at the Denver International Film Festival, where the local two-spirit group had done a prayer and also a song for its international release. Two books that I recommend. One is Reclaiming Two Spirits, that was just put out this year, which talks about the sexuality, spiritual renewal, and sovereignty in Native America. This one was written by Gregory D. Smithers. The other is kind of a biography, the two-spirit journey of Mani Chakabi. This is an amazing book which talks about this personal journey that Chakabi had taken and recognizing her two-spirit identity. I was able to participate in a book club where we did talk about the two-spirit journey by Mani Chakabi with the local LGBT Center of Colorado. Also, past books that have been published is Two-Spirit People, and then also the Queer Indigenous Studies, a critical look at two-spirit identity, and then also a poetic collection called Sovereign Erotics. And I think that's really all I had. I think I went through this pretty quickly.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Cristosto. Do we have questions? Are there any questions here in the room? Or I will check the chat. So far in the chat, we have a thank you. I know one question that I had, I'm going to get back in front of the camera. Cristosto, one of the things you mentioned was about the connection to the land and Indigenous people and the connection to the land. And this maybe isn't so much of a question as it is just a comment, an observation that I think for Western European, there is, and for most Americans, there is not an understanding of the actual real, I want to say even physical feeling of connection to the land that Indigenous people have and to the natural world. That it is a part of that the land and humans and the land, that there is an actual very symbiotic, or I'm not saying that right, but connection. And I think that's not understood. I don't think it's ever been understood. I think people are maybe beginning to understand as they understand the importance of taking care of the planet. And I think it's Native American and First Nation people who are going to help lead the way in doing that. I've seen some things recently of First Nation people helping with restoring salmon to streams, restoring forests, restoring, working with all kinds of other efforts. So what is your observation on that?
And I think you're right. There's not a whole lot of discussions held around the connection between Indigenous people and communities to the environment and also the land. Because if we look back at history, that's one of the things I think about as far as like the disruption that has happened. That if that disruption didn't happen, how would the Indigenous people who were actually part of those specific places of their origin, how would they have cared for that land, and how would that have changed a lot of directions for the perspectives of how to interact with that land, how to care, preserve, etc. I know that there's a lot of policies that Native American tribes are utilizing and presenting to define the parameters of how to preserve many of the resources that exist on tribal communities, so that their resources don't deplenish or deplete. And a lot of it is really interesting how that happens. And water, I think, is one of the main ideas that serves as an effort to preserve. Water is one of those sacred elements that many Indigenous people look at. Recently with the pipelines, that was a huge push for Indigenous people. And there was a huge Two-Spirit representation there to show that, that there is support. And that they also believe the same things that Indigenous people believe in regards to natural resources.
Thank you. I want to say welcome to Destiny. Destiny, we're glad you joined us. I see you're taking care of a little one. Are there other questions?
I suppose I had a question.
Yes, please go ahead, Anna.
I know you mentioned several times, and I know I've heard everywhere that Two-Spirit people have incredible importance to their communities. And I know it's probably a really personal thing, tribally, like, you know. I guess if my question is mainly, if there isn't one specific way that most Two-Spirit people contribute to their society, like, what role do you play, I guess? I'd be interested in hearing the kind of the role you take in your society, in your tribes.
My personal tribe, where I come from the Muscular Apache tribe in New Mexico. I know that there are federal services that are looking at a lot of mental health in my community, where they're addressing a lot of young people and encouraging them to come in and participate in the services there. But as far as my own participation, I think a lot of ways that I try to look at as far as best representing myself for Two-Spirit people is to be an ally and to also be an advocate. I know when I first started out the advocacy with the Two-Spirit identity, I was really uneducated, very naive about the historical, cultural, traditional, and lingual aspect of what it meant. And it wasn't through this education that I was able to understand in a much larger scale the impact and the importance of what it meant to continue to advocate for this identity. So I still participate when I can or when I'm invited. And one of the tools that I use is the Two-Spirit film, where I utilize that in my classroom and have discussions around it, and even try to point out some of the more specific notions of what's important for the definition of what it means to be Indigenous and also to participate on a Two-Spirit level with that identity. Also, learning about literature, Two-Spirit writers is another way that I engage communities, and really also having conversations about this literature is one of the ways that I continue to advocate. So when I look at my participation in this concept, I'm trying to broaden it a lot more so that there's more interactive, not so much focusing on the kinds of talks that we're having here, which is important, by the way, but engaging in a much larger scale where these places are happening on a day-to-day level, such as schools is one of the places that I look at. My personal classroom, we gauge conversations around this concept of equity and inclusion and diversity. But I do think on a much larger scale, I think a lot of tribal communities are looking at this idea of disparity and looking at how they can address that specifically to their communities. And I think it is through policy where I think a lot of these changes can be made. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, thank you. I don't think I phrased it very well, but yeah, you answered my question. Thank you. I mean, yeah, you do good work. I mean, and thank you. I know part of kind of your work is holding this presentation, and I guess I just wanted to thank you for doing that. For the longest period of my life, I had never heard the word Two-Spirit. So, you know, just you do really good work. I don't know if I need to tell you that. I'm sure you know, but you know, thank you.
Well, it's good to hear. I mean, it's good to hear people that are connecting with this concept. Yes.
Chris, so you just mentioned policy is one way to help. Are there certain policies that you know of that could be written, created, let's say on a college campus, just for a start, or policies in the community?
I think a really good place to start is if you have a diversity, ethnic and equality, sorry, my mind slipped. Equity, equality, and diversity inclusion group on campus. I think that might be a good way to start. Getting people together and having conversations about how they can establish more inclusivity from a faculty point of view and also from a student body point of view. I think is always a goal, which I think a lot of colleges now and universities are really focused on this idea of broadening that scope of equity and inclusion and creating that mode of diversity. But as far as a national policy, I think that's a very complex thing to look at because when you start to look at policies and legislation, you have to also look at the ones that have been enacted prior and how it's going to impact those previous legislations and policies.
Thank you. And I see Reem, did you want to contribute?
Hi, I'm the DEI coordinator at KCKCC. Thank you so much. I just would like to say that I was only able to join toward the end. I was wondering if you can share the resources you just shared in your presentation so that we can also share with our students.
Yes, I'd be glad to. I mean, I can turn my presentation into a PDF and send it to Jennifer.
That would be great. Thank you so much. And this whole idea of having like a two-spirit identity is great. And me and Jennifer shared a little bit about it before the presentation. And it's always very, it's a rich experience just to share these new ideas with the community and with the students, because like, I'm not sure that not that many people know about this.
Yeah, I think it's a concept that I think is that is continuing to be discovered. I've been advocating probably for like almost 20 years now, but I've seen like a lot of growth in a lot of communities and a lot of activities and movement So I know that there's progress being made, but I think it's through programs such as yours and this extension of invitation to a lot of people who continue to advocate. I think is where it really makes a difference.
Sure, thank you so much.
I would agree. I've noticed a lot more, as I was going around talking about your presentation yesterday, more and more students who had said, when I said, do you know what Two-Spirit is? And I had a few students who said, yes, they knew. So, and there's still a lot that don't know. So there's still a lot to be done. But I was pleased to find a few students here and there that said, yes, I've heard of Two-Spirit. I know what that is. So.
And one thing I'll say about the film Two Spirits, since that has had an international platform, there's a lot of other like mainstream films that have come out, you know, utilizing the concept of two spirits as the main theme in the films. So I know there's been a broadening of the scope of this two spirit identity and concept. When I send this over to Jennifer, I'll document some of those mainstream films.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Do we have any other questions here in the room or in the chat? I don't see any more. I just see thank yous and wonderful presentation, and thank you so much. So, okay. I think we've come to the end of our program. It's hard to say goodbye. And Chrysosto, we miss seeing you really in person. The last two times you were here in person. We miss having that time together. But we are glad that you are still doing well and doing the work to advocate for Two-Spirit and for Indigenous people. We appreciate your hard work in this presentation. So thank you very much.
Well, yeah, I just want to thank the Kansas City Community College for continuing to think of me. I really love this interaction and this relationship.
Thank you. All right. Thank you to everyone. And that's our program for today.
Okay.